Welcome to the AI+HI project. I'm Nichol Bradford, SHRM's Executive in Residence for AI+HI. Thanks for joining us. Each week, we sit down with visionaries from the world of business, tech, and HR to provide you with deep insights, actionable strategies, and practical advice for harnessing the transformative potential of artificial intelligence, that's AI, combined with human ingenuity, that's HI. This week, we're discussing the future of change management and how change has to change in an AI-driven world. Our guest is none other than Andy Biladeau. He's SHRM's Chief Transformation Officer. Welcome to the AI+HI project, Andy.
So great to be here, Nicole. Thanks for having me.
So, Andy, I was so excited to book you for this time because of conversations that we've had about how change will need to change in the age of AI. But before we get into that, I wanted to hear more about transformation. Throughout your career, you have been on the forefront of driving transformative change in various organizations. And can you share with us what drew you to the opportunity and the challenge of leading SHRM's transformation? And what are the unique elements that you see there?
Yeah, absolutely. As I reflect back on my career, you observe the same thing that I do, which is that I somehow have always found myself in the middle of large scale transformation efforts. Going all the way back to the beginning of my career, operating as a human capital consultant, um, led a lot of large programs around HR operating model transformations, large scale HCM system implementations. Always had their own people, process, and technology changes associated with them. And I did that for a while. And the exciting part about those experiences was that I got a ton of reps at looking at different industries and different types of change and different types of transformation and all the different variables that kind of went into those that went really well and those that maybe didn't fully meet their potential. And so I always look back at that part of my career as my learning phase around, hey, if you were going to get a ton of at bats to kind of see different types of change in a really compressed time frame, that's how I think of that chapter of my career. But at the same time, I was always on the outside looking in to an extent, meaning as an external consultant, you're kind of in an observer capacity to a great extent. And so the next chapter of my career took me to Target Corporation, where I helped lead the learning team for the stores organization, and actually led change management for the stores organization through a large scale operating model transformation that they were going through at the time. And I love that part of my career because I actually got to sit in the chair as an HR leader and have to make decisions and trade off choices and build stakeholder alignment around change. But more importantly, I think I also was making decisions through the lens of when we make those trade off calls, we're going to have to live with the consequences. I think as an external consultant, sometimes you get the benefit of rolling off the project. As an internal HR leader, you have to live with the choices that you make for a long period of time. And so I think it just changes kind of the way you assess materiality or the impact of what you're doing. And you also know that you're going to have to lead that change internally. And so you want to balance what the organization can adopt versus maybe what might be unrealistic. And so got a lot of experience kind of living and breathing internal change management there at Target. And then most recently, I was part of the founding team at the Josh Bersin Company. And that took me back into the world of consulting, where I actually got to help Fortune 100 companies navigate through their own transformations, primarily HR operating model transformations and HR technology transformations. But again, it kind of put me back in that chair to say, if I were to look at all these different variables in the context of the business environment this company's operating in, where might they be able to strategically make some investments to drive change? And so again, got a lot of reps, but was bringing that practitioner experience to the table there. And then that ultimately led me to SHRM. And SHRM is in the midst of undergoing our own transformation experience. There's really two elements of our transformation. There's the externally facing transformation that we're driving around how do we elevate the member experience, both digitally and in person. And there's a lot of work going on in that space. Um, Simultaneously, we're also, as you know, Nicole, we're retooling ourselves internally with new capabilities to future proof ourselves because we know that market conditions are going to change, the demands of HR are going to change, the skills and capabilities of HR are going to change. And to answer your original question about why that intrigued me is I don't think that there's ever been a more critical moment for the human resources profession than the one that we're in currently. And that's largely attributable to the massive technological advancement that we're seeing, which I know we're going to get into and talk about a lot today. It's also around talent and the perception of talent by organizations and that employer employee relationship and how that's shifting right before our eyes. And then you have a lot of business model transformation that's going on as well. Every company on the planet is trying to change their DNA in terms of who they are, in terms of their offerings or the type of company they want to be, or maybe a cultural transformation. And so I think the reality is that it's nonstop change, and I don't see that changing anytime soon.
We came to SHRM for the same reasons as well. What really excited me about coming to SHRM is that HR is such a prolific function. Every organization in the world has some version of that. And the potential of HR leaders to be able to support and create positive change and to really get this right, because AI is such a transformative technology and it affects every aspect of the business, from the business model to employee experience to like everything. And
Yeah.
HR has such a incredible opportunity to help that go well with organizations. But one of the things that we've talked about is that this change is a bit different than previous styles of change. Could you share, how does traditional change management have to change to evolve to effectively support transformative technologies like AI? And is there a difference between the previous versions of predictive and machine learning and generative AI?
Yeah, I think that that's the crux of the question facing HR today, right? Which is the HR operating model over the past 15 or 20 years has really been built around isolated functions within HR. And so for a lot of HR professionals, what that meant was they grew up in a certain area, right? They are talent acquisition specialists or they're learning and development specialists or total rewards experts. And they have deep subject matter expertise in each of those areas. You also have HR generalists and business partners who operate more as that frontline consultant into the business. But I think what AI is pushing HR to do at an accelerated pace is for all of those independent HR functions to actually step back from their subject matter area and start to immerse themselves in the business operating model of the clients that they serve internally. And what I mean when I say that is that if you start to think about the implications of AI on the fundamental business model of an organization, that has massive ramifications from a talent perspective. And those are not going to be isolated to specific areas of HR. And so it really means that those specialists that have maybe lived in those COEs historically are going to have to break out of their comfort zone and immerse themselves in the business model to truly understand when AI starts to hit the operations of the organization, what are the knockdown impacts on talent requirements? I'll give you an example. If AI were to disrupt a certain part of the business, a learning professional would need to understand how does that affect the business model so that I can start to think about reskilling and upskilling the people in those operational roles so that they have the skills and capabilities not only to use the artificial intelligence, but use it to support the business and growth strategy, right? That's a very different dynamic than an HR business partner sitting down with a business client internally, intaking training needs, sharing those back to the learning and development function. They build out a program, they deploy the program, and they move on to the next project. I think that what you're going to find is a deep convergence between HR and business over the next 5 years or so. And I know we'll talk about it more, but I also think the other area HR is going to have to get smart on really quickly is going to be really truly understanding some of the technological pieces of this in terms of the capabilities of what the technology can actually do.
Yes, and also, what about continuous change? I think
Yeah.
historically, people would think of change management as this thing that they would do, and they would do a change. But one of the things you mentioned earlier is that this change is going to be continuous. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, the type of change we're experiencing now is perpetual and persistent, meaning that, in those old system implementation programs that I led and was mentioning earlier, we had a really formulaic approach to change management, meaning you would mark go live on the calendar. You would then do a work back plan to say, all right, we're going to need 4 weeks of training. And then before that, we're going to need a 6 week communications program. And then prior to that, we're going to need a 3 week stakeholder alignment program. And all of that has been completely disrupted because no longer do we have those extended timelines, right? The changes hitting our organizations faster than we can prepare. But what we can do is we can start to build muscle internally around agility and flexibility and curiosity and the learning culture for continuous upskilling. Those are things that are going to future proof organizations because you're not going to necessarily be able to anticipate what the implications of the technology are going to be in advance. And so you're going to have to respond in real time and you're going to have a learning function that can respond to those demands in real time. You're going to have a talent acquisition function that can respond to those demands in real time. Probably going to have some talent mobility questions you're going to have to answer pretty quickly as people start to move around the organization, or you're going to need to redeploy people within the organization. So again, not only is it incredibly compressed in terms of the timeline, but just the nature, scale, and scope of the change is radically different than anything we've ever seen before.
Yeah. One of the things that we've been seeing is, as you know, I'm out there with our members and in the marketplace and looking for cases so that we can study what are the determinants of success and what are the determinants of failure. And,
Yeah.
still, Rand Corporation put out a study a couple of weeks ago where they looked at the determinants of failure again and their estimate. And they see a lot from where they're at, especially with their integration into the federal government. Um, Still, they say that it's 80% of these implementations are failing. And that also lines up with historically, different references had 50 to 80% of the machine learning and predictive implementations failing. And so, the determinants of failure include things that make it really clear that there's this social cultural piece to it. All
Yeah.
of the organizations that are succeeding are the ones where they seem to really understand that this is not a tech upgrade. This is not a Windows 95 upgrade. This is the social cultural way of working. And so one of the things, for example, BCG is warning all of its clients, it's 70% ways of working, 70% people, and it's only 30% data, technology and data. And those are table stakes. Like, you have to have that to be in the game. And,
Yep.
and lots of people have, issues with their data. But even then, do you have a culture of data? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the cultural role of HR and how that ties into change management.
Yeah, I want to pick apart something you shared, Nicole, and you and I have talked about this before, right? Which is what we're witnessing right now is not an evolution, but a revolution happening. And I think you're spot on that HR is squarely in the middle of this conversation because on the one side, you have the technology advancements. And so HR needs to get really smart really quickly around the language, the capabilities, the possibilities, and the risks associated with these technologies. And they need to kind of have that mental framework in place. And then simultaneously, like I was talking about earlier, they have to truly understand the operational requirements of the business and the underlying business model that's driving the company forward. And they have to operate as kind of the translator between the technology piece, the business piece, and the human piece. And that's a big role. And I think what you're finding is that a lot of HR organizations aren't able to adapt quickly enough. And I think some of it could be attributable to starting with building those partnerships with both technology and senior business leaders. I think at SHRM, we've done a really nice job. I lead our technology function here at SHRM. I spend a lot of time with our CHRO. And the reason that I spend a lot of time with Jim is because I need to be able to explain here are the potential risks associated with our employees using this technology. What are the potential talent implications? but also where there are acceleration points where if we embed this technology into the business, we're going to see a multiplier effect in terms of productivity. And you kind of have to balance all those variables of risk, productivity, impact to talent, and culture. And so simultaneously, as an executive team here at SHRM, we're constantly having the conversation about how do we accelerate productivity without necessarily taking on unnecessary risk and trying to find that right balance in between. I think being able to facilitate that conversation as an HR leader is going to be essential going forward. And again, it's going to require pretty deep technical knowledge of what these tools can do and the real frontline impact that they will have on some of the jobs within the organization.
When I was speaking with Christopher Fernandez, who ran Microsoft's HR AI implementation, we were talking about what the future of HR looks like. One of the things that he sees sort of three roles. One is value added strategy for the business. So what you mentioned before, like deep integration into the rest of the business because of understanding the business model in order to do the workforce planning, all of that. Then the second role that he sees is that responsible AI and governance sits with HR, that
Yeah.
they become the people, to your point about really understanding the technology, who really they really understand the people part, and they really understand the technology so they can hold the responsible AI and governance principles for the organization and be that the subject matter expert on that. So while IT might implement the compliance or the systems or the instances, it's really HR that holds the social contract with the employees about, knowing that it's fair, knowing that it's transparent, knowing, that the system, um, you know, is not biased against them. And then the third thing he sees is really holding that employee experience, like you mentioned, and that the silos between the different functions start to go away. And so I'm curious about how you feel about the responsible AI and governance sitting
Yeah.
with HR.
I think it sits, in terms of accountability within HR, and that's actually the approach that we've adopted here at SHRM.
Mm.
And so our first step out of the gate in terms of our AI implementation here was to establish an acceptable use policy around generative AI. Um, we coupled that, right, and we worked extensively to define the rules of the road on how we wanted employees to use generative AI and let them know the risks associated with it. And so here's what's within boundaries of okay, here's what's off limits in terms of data to share or expose. And so we had to get that codified in partnership with HR of here are the rules of the road around using generative AI at SHRM and getting everyone at the organization to sign and acknowledge that, right? That was step one. And step two was establishing a common language around this because as Nicole, you live in this world, right? There's no shortage of hype and buzzwords within AI. In fact, I was in San Francisco earlier this week, and on the Waymo drive from the airport into downtown, I counted 13 different billboards advertising different companies and AI capabilities. There's just so much noise around this. And so, for us as an organization at SHRM, the first step on the journey for us after the acceptable use policy was hey, let's just make sure we're all talking the same language when it comes to this technology, because that's going to allow us to communicate better of what is generative AI and the risks associated with it versus what is AI automation and maybe a little bit of a lower risk profile there. So step two was language unification. Then step three for us was actually training people on the specific tools. And I think that this is where, so many organizations just assume everybody has gotten in and played with these tools and knows how to effectively use them. We've done a number of pulse surveys here at SHRM to understand generative AI usage, productivity gains that have been realized through the use of generative AI. And one of the most interesting findings that came out of that was that the people who took the training on how to write effective prompts or how to increase productivity using generative AI actually demonstrated better productivity gains. And I think that's probably not
Yeah.
ostensibly a surprise, but it just reinforces that there was no training for how to use generative AI. It was released into the wild without a change management plan, without a quick reference card or a playbook. And I think there's been an assumption that people implicitly just understand how to accelerate their work using the technology, and we're just not finding that to be the case. We're about to release some research in terms of the impact specifically to HR around AI, and as part of that study, we actually looked at the adoption and usage of HR professionals within generative AI, and it's surprisingly low. In fact, it's about 26% of HR organizations who have actually implemented AI solutions within their company, and we think that that's somewhat attributable to HR professionals themselves not getting hands on keyboard and actually playing and toying with technology to see what it can do. And I think if you're not in that constant experimentation phase with what these types of platforms can allow you to do or unlock, you're not going to be able to effectively understand the impact of the business, right? If you don't actually use the tool yourself, how are you ever going to be able to anticipate spots within the organization where it might be able to either increase productivity or automate things altogether? And so the number one piece of advice I like to give to people is just get in and play with the tool and try it over and over. And you're not going to write the perfect prompt the first time. But the better you get at prompting with specificity, you're going to see better results and output. I think the reality is that we're all short on time. There's a lot going on. And generative AI hasn't necessarily made its way into the embedded workflow of professionals quite yet. So it does require that extra step of doing a task and then a little bit of code switching to say, oh, wait a minute, where might generative AI be able to help me with this activity that I'm working on? And then actually going to a separate screen and putting in a prompt and going through that experience and bringing it back to the work that you were doing. I think over time, what you'll find is some of these tools and applications start to get embedded in the flow of work into the workflow. And that's going to force people to get their hands on the keyboard with the technology.
Yeah, that leads to so I want to share one bit of research and then ask the next question. So Upwork did a very large research project too on this, and of the companies that have brought AI in or generative AI in, only 26% of them have actually trained people to use it. And so, the headline that went around on this research was that something like 96% of CEOs and leaders expected there to be a productivity gains. And 77% of the workers said actually their workload just increased.
Yeah.
And it's because, they're having to, they don't actually know how to use it. And
Yeah.
so the way that they're using it is increasing the workload versus increasing the productivity. But
Yeah.
that leads to another question too that is, I think, really important is like, how do we define productivity? You and I have talked about this. And so one, how do we define productivity? And then the second part, what you mentioned around workflows, and this I think gets back to the cultural piece of it, is that the sort of like the bottoms up experimentation appears from the success cases, appears to be how you get those workflows, redesigned in a way that drives the business. So could you speak to, how should we define productivity? And then how do we marry that to workflow updates that actually drive the business?
Yeah. This is a really important question, and I'm actually going to answer those questions in reverse because I think the workflow piece of it drives our definition of productivity in a way, right? As I think about, and I'll just pick on HR technology here, right? Just because I think it's a useful example for the audience. But if you think about your traditional human capital management system and the user experience, both either as an administrator or as an employee using one of those applications, right? It is very, very much built on the database model where there are predefined workflows for you to execute a transaction. So, just to give you an example, if I want to give you a spot bonus, Nicole, right? I will go ahead and log into the human capital management system. I'll find the tile that allows me to navigate into total rewards, and then I'll find your name, and then I'll enter an amount and a date, and that'll integrate with the payroll system. And there's probably 5 or 6 levels of approval required to execute that transaction. And if you think about that user experience, it's built on a couple things. One is that it's much more of this branched model, and it's kind of guiding you through based on what the use case is you want to push through that system or execute on that workflow, right? That's sort of the old mental model and the architecture of how HCM systems have been built historically. If you think about the future of what the workflow experience could look like, it's going to be much more of that generative AI user interface where you're able to actually type in a request, something like, I want to give Nicole a spot bonus of $100. And you're welcome. Uh, and on the backside, hidden from view to the user, the large language model is actually going to be able to tap into all the required systems to understand how to orchestrate that workflow based on what you've entered into the prompt. I think that that's going to be Gen 1 of what's next. And then I think Gen 2 will be around activation, meaning I'd like to give Nicole that $100 spot bonus. And so, it'll pull up, hey, here are the parameters of what you're asking me to do. Would you like to execute? And then the ability for the user to actually go in and accept and execute, and then all of those workflows to be automatically pushed to the underlying systems to run that transaction end to end. That's a completely different experience for the user. And if you think about what that does to the role of HR within the organization, is it takes that entire service delivery layer and it effectively just automates it to the individual and allows them to do a transaction without having to navigate through 10 or 15 different screens, right? And so from the user side, they're going to experience a lot of productivity. Now, within HR, what that's going to do is there's a lot of people who support those processes or are process owners around some of those things. And so they're going to get a lot of capacity back. And I think what this does is it does crack open that conversation around what does productivity really mean? Because if you look at the way people are quantifying productivity in a lot of research today, it's focused really on time savings, meaning how many hours per week does AI save you? And that's one way to look at this, which is it's simply just allowing me to do more volume of the tasks I'm already doing today. And I think that's a function of still operating this database mindset versus in the future. I think the way that we're going to talk about productivity is much more okay, if that service delivery layer is self service for employees, what is the type of work that you now are unlocked and able to do that brings you energy or that allows you to tap into the things that you're uniquely skilled and qualified to do if you're not focusing on maybe that transactional administrative work you historically have been focused on. And so I think temporarily productivity gains will be defined by how much time savings people are realizing from implementing AI. I think the next generation of productivity will be defined by how much are people operating at the top of their license and doing the work that they're uniquely qualified to do to spark innovation or drive growth within their organization. And I think it's going to be a little bit of time before we get there, but that's my sense of where this is going.
Mhm. I agree with you. I think, what we've historically called the innovative organizations and what some people call the dynamic organizations that are very growth oriented or transformation oriented. I think that those types of organizations are compatible with having an AI ready culture or an AI compatible culture. And so we'll see that evolution that you just described. But
Yeah.
before we get there, and this is one of our final questions, what are some of the mistakes that for this generation, for like what's happening right now? So we kind of know the historical mistakes, but for some of the people out there listening, what are some of the easy mistakes that they can avoid
Yeah.
around implementing and supporting the implementation of this generation of AI?
Yeah, it's a really good question because I think we talk to a lot of companies who are going through that experience right now, which is, hey, we've implemented versions of AI or we bought systems or tools or applications and we've seen some productivity gains, but we're not necessarily sure how we can get a handle on aggregate contributions of AI to the organization. And I think that actually goes back to how are you allowing individuals to experiment with the different tools or systems that are out there? Is it a decentralized approach where you're letting individuals go swipe a company P card or an individual credit card to go out and find tools that work for them or they think are going to work for them, to tinker with and experiment with them? Are you taking a decentralized approach? Are you taking a highly centralized approach, which we see some organizations doing, meaning that you are going to govern from the center the only allowable tools for employees that they can use and be somewhat prescriptive in how they can actually be used or implemented? That's at the other end of the spectrum. And then you've got some organizations that are sort of in the middle where there's absolutely a layer of governance around it to say nothing's going to come into our technology architecture that hasn't gone through architecture review or data security and data privacy review. And so there will be sanctioned AI tools. But we also recognize that with the general availability with a lot of these large language models, that our employees are going to go use them. And there's not a lot that we can do to stop them. And so what guardrails do you want to put around those publicly available tools? I think that the organizations that are getting this right are balancing the risk profile of giving access to tools. They're looking at specific places where they can quantify the amount of productivity or volume of work or time savings, whatever metric that they're looking at, and that they can quantify that centrally so they can measure the effectiveness of these investments. But they're also recognizing that there's going to be a lot of instances because the market's moving so quickly where they're going to have to turn tools on, experiment, and turn them off and redirect. And so being able to be agile to say, we tried this tool over here, it didn't work, and we actually think that there's a better option or tool over here. But you have to have some degree of central visibility of what's currently in use within the organization to be able to make those investment decisions. And so I think hovering somewhere in the middle of that spectrum I described, probably the prudent approach at this point in time. And then I think you made a really good point too, Nicole, about you're constantly balancing this speed to quality ratio, meaning that AI can certainly accelerate your work, the speed of the work. You also have to balance the quality output that that's producing and not over index on moving too quickly at the expense of delivering quality because there can be this sense of, well, I'm generating more output, therefore that's better. But the reality is that could compromise your business model potentially. And I think over time, when we talk about that next generation of where this is going, I do think as the intelligence gets better, as the accuracy gets better, speed will become commoditized in that you can get to answers very quickly with a high degree of accuracy. And then the question will become, do you have the humans in place to amplify it with the quality piece of it? Are they coming up with the innovative ideas? Are they the ones finding novel applications for the technology? Do you have the people in place within your organization to be able to do that? And so that's sort of where I think this is all going. But balancing risk, speed, and quality are probably the things to keep focused on.
Mhm. Great. And final question, the so many HR people, I've looked at the same research you did that they're not quite using it yet, and we've seen that when in our research at SHRM that when an HR person experiences AI, they're 16 times more likely to see it as job expanding because they're like,
Yeah.
oh my gosh. Um, but for the people who are just getting started on their journey, and and maybe they're in organizations that don't naturally think or don't yet understand the role that HR plays in like these successful implementations. What advice would you give them? What should they say? How should they, what should they say to their CEO, their CTO? Like um how should they communicate and what should they communicate so people really understand the role that HR has to play in these transformations?
I think you're exactly right, Nicole, where step one is you've got to experiment with it yourself. You have got to go into generative AI tools and start to test and learn because so much of the capability is hidden to the user and under the hood, right? When I talked about that paradigm of that sort of guided workflow or branched workflow, systems were designed in the past to kind of showcase their functionality or what was possible by guiding you down those workflows. Again, when you're faced with a blank screen and there's no user manual, it's all hidden underneath the surface of what it can do. And so, absolutely, without a doubt, step number one that I highly recommend is get in and start trying to find interesting ways or different ways to put prompts into these generative AI tools so that you can get better at, at that skill. I think step two is actually look at your existing technology stack, because I think there's a lot of places where there's applications that you already have access to as part of your enterprise experience or enterprise technology experience that have AI components to them that you can go experiment with without having to go buy a new tool. So step two is, what do I already currently have available to me that's provided by the organization? And then I think step three is just start with one use case, right? As an HR professional, maybe it's, I want to be able to use generative AI to write a better job description. It's really easy to go into a Gen AI tool and get a job description. But how do you make it a goal of yours to get a high quality job description based on your unique organization out of one of these tools? And if you give yourself that specific of a goal, it's going to force you to practice the things that you need to learn to unlock all the value that's hidden underneath the surface. And so I always recommend find one use case that you want to get better at and use that as your training ground. So step one, get your hands on the tools. Step two, know what's already available to you. And step three, create a goal for yourself or a use case for yourself that you can try to solve using generative AI.
That's great. Well, Andy, it's such a pleasure chatting with you. That's going to do it for this week's episode. A big thank you to our guest for sharing their experience and deep insights. Before we say goodbye, I encourage you to follow the AI+HI project wherever you enjoy your podcast. If you enjoyed today's podcast, please take a moment to comment, leave a review. And finally, if you can find all of our episodes on our website at shrm.org/AI+HI. Thanks for joining the conversation, and we'll catch you next time.